All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another class of web and mobile systems. So in the last class, we had discussed about the second half of our navbar design, which was basically to create a responsive navbar. Essentially, the idea behind it was that if you create a navbar and depending on the size of the media device that was going to access your website, right, or your front-end user interface, the nav bar will essentially respond to the size of the device that is going to access, right? So what we learned from there is the fact that if, let's say, you have a device which is of your regular PC or desktop width, which is around the threshold of 768 pixels, then the entirety of your nav bar will be displayed. But as you keep on reducing the size of your screen, the width of your screen from 768 pixels to smaller and smaller and smaller, then the nav bar will also respond to that behavior by shrinking to a point where essentially the entirety of the nav bar will collapse under what we had designed to be a hamburger menu. And then users of your website can essentially click on that hamburger menu, and then the menu that is collapsed inside of that icon will be displayed back, right? So the way we are able to implement that is through the help of this CSS property that is known as media queries. So you can write media queries using @ and then media query, and then within a first bracket, you can specify the max width of the screen as a threshold value in a way to mimic the implementation of if-else statements, essentially, because we cannot write full-fledged programming controls in CSS or HTML, but we do have some capabilities where we can implement these type of CSS functionalities, or which kind of mimics the behavior of if-else. So continuing our discussion, one of the last topics in fundamental CSS that we are going to be covering today is about styling HTML tables, right? Tables are one of the important facets of any kind of web systems, which are used to essentially display any kind of, let's say, statistical information, financial information, information about grouping of various stuff, and things like that, right? So we want to make sure that we know how to style the tables. And in the process of styling the tables, we are also going to learn another new concept of CSS that is known as pseudo elements, right? So remember, initially, when we were designing our links and stuff like that, or even when we were designing our menu, the nav bar, right? We had talked about this new concept called pseudo classes, right? So pseudo classes generally encapsulates the behavior in which, let's say, a certain element, if that is not a part of the DOM, right, but that needs to be dynamically generated. So for example, how would you design your page if a user essentially hovers their mouse over a certain element on your web page, right? How would you change that design? So that can be covered by pseudo classes and stuff like that. So if you have visited a link, if a link is unvisited, so all of these different properties are covered using pseudo classes, right? So on contrast to that, on the other side of the spectrum, pseudo elements are also styling rules or properties that are applied to different elements of your web page, which is not a part of the static DOM, right? So that means that it is not inherently a part of the DOM itself when you try to build the DOM for your website, but it is something that can be dynamically generated when you express that styling rule using CSS, right? So tables are one of the best examples in which you can kind of depict the utility of pseudo elements. So today we are going to be looking into that and trying to understand what are pseudo elements, and then how it can help us kind of apply more styling rules on the fly or dynamically, kind of similar to what we learned when we were working with pseudo classes itself, right? So first and foremost, to start off with, we won't be using the very simple table that we had created for our pages. If you recall, in the projects table, I believe somewhere we had, yeah, here. So this is the location where we had used to understand the structure of a table in HTML, right? So to give you a quick kind of refresh as to what it consists of is whenever you design a table, essentially you have the table tag. Okay, it starts with the environment tags with the tag name table, and within that you can provide it with a caption, right? That will appear above or below depending on where you specify it, or you can make other changes to it as well. And then you can further divide your table environment into three different semantical tags, right? So the first one is basically the table header, which is indicated by the tag name thead. And then you have the body of the table, which is indicated by the semantic tag tbody. And then you have the semantic tag for the footer of the table, which is tfoot. Okay. Essentially, there is no mandatory requirement that you need to break down your table in such a way in these three semantic tags. But the reason why people suggest that you should do that is because that gives you a little bit of more flexibility when it comes to styling the table itself. You can individually select these three different segments of the table, and you can apply different styling rules if you wish to do so, rather than selecting individual rows from the table and then trying to style them separately, right? So this gives you an additional layer of grouping your different table rows depending on which semantic body sections that they belong to, right? Another thing within the table head is that when you're trying not just table head, but in general, if you try to create a table, right, you have two different properties or two different tag names that are available to you. The first one is, of course, when you're trying to create the header or the rows of the table, you use the tag tr, which stands for table row. And then there is no concept of a table column as such. There is no tc. The way we kind of implement the table is by, for each row, we implement individual data cells, right, in order to implement the table. So each of these data cells is represented by using TD, which stands for table data. And the only exception to this is the first row of the table, where we don't use TD, but we use a semantic data cell tag that is known as TH, which stands for the table header. So as a result of that, when we see something like TH, we know that that is essentially the header row of the table and the heading of the table itself and the different heading of the columns of our table that will be involved, right? So in order to work on today's example and basically get an understanding of styling, we would want to implement a table that is a little bit more extensive than this basic table that we have, so that we can use a little bit more CSS properties in order to design this table. So what I'm going to do is basically create our own calendar page, right? So we know essentially if you kind of look into the whole idea of let's say you want to create a calendar, right? So if you say Google Calendar, and if you go to the images, right, you can see how a calendar looks like. And it can be represented in a tabular fashion as well, okay? So you have all of these different rows that represents the different weeks of the month. And then you have these individual data cells that represents the days for that particular week, right? And then within that, you have all of these different events that can be represented using different colors, right? Depending on what type of event they are. So for example, here in this toy example that we see, all the personal events such as birthdays or anniversaries, they have a specific color, right? And then there are other events which are not all day events. They are represented using these just bullet points that are there. And then some of them have check marks for reminders and stuff like that. And then you can hide some of the events as well, and then kind of couple that with pseudo classes kind of CSS properties, where if you hover over that event and if there is any additional details over that event, then that will be kind of shown to the users if they want to get some additional details as to what is happening, right? So we want to first do this in two steps, right? The first is, of course, the bare bone layout. So we want to code this whole table using HTML first, and then try to kind of apply some basic table styling rules to this whole table environment in order to kind of mimic or clone the behavior of, let's say, something similar to a Google Calendar, not exactly the same, so that we can understand as many CSS properties as we can kind of gather together to see how they are applicable in towards styling a particular table. So within the pages environment, the first thing that I'm going to do is basically create a new HTML file, and let me call that HTML table, HTML underscore table underscore styling, although this is not styling, but let's just say for the sake of HTML table styling tutorial or demo, shorter word, .html. Okay. And then we will use HTML5 as our boiler template generator, using the HTML language support snippet that we have activated for our Visual Studio Code. And that will just give us a very basic boiler template, right? So here we can change the title of the document page, essentially, and we can call it HTML table styling demo. Something like this that will intuitively give us an idea as to what this is all about. And then in CSS, I'm going to set up a new CSS page just to apply this to this particular page. So I will just say HTML, CSS, HTML table, CSS, okay? CSS page, something like this, okay? .css. All right, so what I want to do is this can remain empty for the time being, and what we can do is basically just say the basic stuff that we have is that we can give a margin of 0. We can set a padding of 0, and then we can do a border box. Okay, we can set all the borders to 0. Okay, or border box equals to box sizing and stuff like that. The whole purpose of doing this is basically to kind of suppress all the default styling rules that any browser has. And then from there, once you have kind of reset all the stylings that might be by default applicable, if you do not specify any styling rules, remember the CSS cascading property that if a styling rule is not available for something, it will keep on looking for the next available styling unit that is going from external, internal, inline to browser itself. So this basically ensures that there is nothing present here. So we want to essentially apply the styling rule here, and maybe in order to check that our linking has actually worked, we can give some kind of background color just to do a sanity check that everything is working properly. So here, in order to link our CSS page, so we can say here CSS external link. So the way we do that, if you all remember, is by using this tag called link itself within the head tags of our HTML page, and we use the CSS property. So we just need to provide within the href where this file is. So right now we are within the pages subfolder. So we need to get one level up in the directory structure, go inside CSS, find our HTML table CSS page, and then essentially just link it up together. And then in the body, we can give probably like a h1 tag just to test demo page, so that whatever CSS styling rule that we have applied, we can double check whether it is being shown or not. And then we can open this with live server, right? So here we can see our page is up and running. There is no padding, there is no margin that is there on the left and right or towards the whole, around the whole content that we have put on the page, and the background color that we have applied is also there. So this kind of gives us a sanity check that we have been able to successfully set up our environment and link the external CSS page that we have created for this particular exercise is actually working, right? So the next thing that we want to do is essentially start putting our content together, which is the HTML body for our calendar itself, right? So what I want to do next is basically create a header, okay? And then within the header, I'm going to put this h1 content here, and then we can just say HTML styling tutorial, HTML table styling demo. Okay, something along these lines, we can put it there. And then after the heading is done, we want to create basically a container for our table. So you can put the main semantic tag here if you want to give it a little bit more semantic kind of structure to this whole style, but I will proceed with the container itself and try to style it from there itself, right? So the first thing that I want to do in order to create containers is create a meaningless tag, which is essentially our div tag. That is our go-to tag name for creating wrappers and containers around contents, and then using that essentially to apply our styling rules. So what I want to do is, first of all, give it a class name, and let's call it calendar, because we are going to create a calendar itself using our HTML table. And then we can name it as the calendar container. Okay. And then within that div tag, what we can essentially start to do is basically code the HTML table environment. All right. And every table environment starts with the table tag name itself, right? And within the table tag name, as we just discussed, you can have what is known as a caption, first and foremost. And then after the caption, you can create three different semantic tags, kind of outlining the three different sections that a table can have. So you can do the head for the header of the table, the body for the body of the table. And then if there is a the footer, then you can create the footer of the table, right? So these are basically what you have. And then within each of these semantic sections, you create a row. And then within each of these rows, you can create your data cell, right? So that is how the boiler template of an HTML table is essentially going to look like, right? So the only exception is, instead of doing a table data cell within the table header, when you're working with the heading or the first row of the table, which are your headings. So when you create the row, your elements or your data cells will be represented using the semantical table heading tag or the th tag rather than the tt tag, right? So this is how you can set up your entire table, and it always helps to kind of sketch your table out to know how many data cells are going to be there, how many rows are you going to create, and then kind of mimic the behavior overall, right? So we know here, for example, if you think of a rough sketch of how you're going to work with the calendar table, is the fact that, let's open this up again and do this. So we will say Google Calendar, okay? And then go to the images. Let's open back our images here, maybe this one, right? So here, if you just check the sketch of any particular month, and of course, this will change from month to month a little bit, okay? Typically, you will be working with what, like 4 to 5 weeks, give or take, right? So if you kind of want to generalize this whole sketch, then we can say that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we will have around 5 rows, and then each of these rows, and this is kind of universal in nature, each of these rows will have about 6 to 7 days. Okay, the 7th day is kind of hidden in this particular picture, but we know that there is 7 days of a week. So we know that the first column, the first row itself also need to have a header tag, and the header tag will essentially represent the label for the day of the week. So you can start from Sunday or you can start from Monday. That depends on your choosing on how you need to move forward with this whole thing, right? So this is basically the sketch that we are working with, and we want to implement this essentially in HTML at this point of time, right? So in table, maybe what I can do is give it an ID if I ever need to kind of access the table itself. So I can say calendar table. Of course, in this page, there is just a single table, so you can use the tag name as the CSS selector, and then the table will be selected, but try to avoid that. Either stick to class names or ID name or a combination of the two. It kind of makes your life a little bit easier than using plain old tag names itself, right? Just like something subjectively, I might suggest you to do. Okay, so for the caption, we basically need to give some sort of label for the month for which this calendar is being created. So the one that I have for my notes, essentially, I'm going to stick to that, and I'm going to work with something like October of 2021. Okay, that's basically the month that I was working with before. Okay, And then we can start basically working with our table header portion, table body portion, and then if necessary, we will also work with the table footer portion. But in this particular example, there is no specific requirement of a footer. The reason why I say so is you generally have footer I wouldn't say generally, but let's say if you're doing something like a finance table or an accounting table, where you have, let's say, different items on the subsequent rows and their individual price, and you need to know what is the total of the sales price that you made in a particular day, and you want to represent that as a tabular data, then that is something that can be represented using the table footer section. The sum part of it is something that you can work with in the footer section. But here in the calendar itself, what the way I did it, at least, is the header portion is just the label of the individual, what do you call the labels of the individual days of the week. And then after that, there is nothing for the footer section. So the rest of the rows that I have in the table, I will group that into the table body itself, right? So let's see how that essentially turns out, how that will look to us if we are trying to code that portion, right? So I will do a table head first, okay? And the whole idea of this table head is to have all of my days label, okay? So I will create one row here, okay? And within that, I need to create essentially 7 data cells as headings for each of the day of the week, right? So that means I will do 1th and then copy that and paste it 6 more times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So I'll start my day of the week with essentially Sunday. So I can do Sunday and then Monday. And then this will take a little bit of time, but that's okay. Wednesday. Okay. And then Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday. All right, so that takes care of our initial row itself. So let's just check the progress real quick if everything is looking all right. Okay, so this is what it will look like. We have not specified anything or anything around this either. So it will look a little bit off-putting at this point of time, but that's fine. We can work on that using CSS, but this is basically what my heading is. So here we can say heading row of the calendar table. Okay, nice and easy. And then here we can say body of the calendar table. All right. So when we start the body, we will start with the semantic tag tbody itself, and then slowly we will kind of work our way around it, right? So all we need to do is mimic this behavior. So we will have for each row, okay, essentially the dates, and this will change from month to month. So this is not something that is static in nature. So we essentially have to look for the month of October 2021. And then essentially I will add from my daily routine some of the events that are applicable to each of these dates. And then some of the holidays that are also present in the month of October that are generally shown in Google Calendar. Like you can see here, you have President's Day, Valentine's Day, first day of Black History Month, first day of Women's History Month, and things like that. So we will kind of embed that as we go forward, right? So I'm just using the information from October 2021 in order to create this particular calendar table, right? So I'm going to set up the first row of the table, okay, and do one for the first week. So let's say I will do a table data tag, right? So from this point onwards, it's all going to be table data and not table heading or anything else. So let's say it starts from 26, and this is based on my prior knowledge of what October 2021 is. I'm not making these up. I'm just using it as a reference in order to set that. So once we have 26, the next thing that we will have is basically 27. And then from 27, let's say we have another tag, which is 28. Okay. And now at this point of time, if you want to apply some sort of event, or if you want to express some sort of event, we will have to think for a little bit, right? If you notice the way it is shown here, the number comes first, okay? But the event itself appears in a new line, okay? So if you want to do that, we cannot do it outside this TD environment, all right? Otherwise, we will have to wrap it inside another, let's say, div container or a block tag in order to represent that, which can be doable, but there is a simpler way that we can kind of express this, right? So in order to put a new line, we know that there is an empty tag that is available for us, which is in the form of break, okay? So we can break it, go to the next line, come here, right? And then we can start a new inline tag in order to make sure that our essentially our contents do not go to a new line by default due to the HTML block tag behavior, right? So any kind of text that you want to specify as inline, right? You kind of wrap that around the span tag. So if you remember, when you're writing simple text and you want that to be in paragraph in block tag fashion, you use the paragraph tag, right? But if you want any kind of text to be in the what do you call it, the inline fashion, the inline default property, then you use it or you specify it using the span tag, okay? After that, I want to create two kind of events for this particular day, which was basically my classes that was on that day, right? So I'm going to create an unordered list, okay, deviating a little bit, and then I will create two list items, and I will basically just write the classes that I used to have back then. That is, one was my database class, and then the other was my full stack development class for 2520 and stuff like that, right? So this is essentially how I would do the labeling of the different calendar events that I have for the day. So essentially what I am achieving here is I put a break tag, which will push it to a new line. Then I will wrap it inside a span tag, and then essentially just put the list items in order to show the different events that I have for that day, okay? So just to show you what it looks like, let's just put a border of 3 in order to get some basic shape and sizing for that particular day. So this is how it will look like. This is basically bleeding out because of these bullet points. But what we know and what we can do from CSS is if we select these list items, we can essentially put the list styles as none, or list styling decoration as none. That is not syntactically correct, what I'm saying, but there is a property which can turn the styling of the list to none, and that essentially will remove this bullet points or these bullets that you see here, and then what will appear is just the name of the event itself, right? So that's an easy way of representing the content that we are seeing, right? So we don't want to see the border from here. That's basically an attribute. So we will put the border back in when we work with the event itself, right? So this takes care of the 28th day. And now the next thing is going to be 29. So where are we? We are in 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have about like 3 more days left, right? So let's say we go for 30, and here we can give it a star to kind of indicate that this day has some events, just to create some separation. And let's do another set of events for the 30th. So we are going to use a break tag just the way we did for the previous one. And then again, we are going to do a span tag. And then within the span tag, we will create an unordered list and then 2 list items, the same as we did for the previous one. And all I'm going to do is specify 3450, the same thing, and CSI2520, right? The same thing that we did previously. And then I think we need how many more days? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we need 2 more to finish off this week, right? So this data cell finishes here. So we need TD. We are on the 30th, right? So that was the previous month, and that has 30 days. So the next date will be 1, and then the next date will be 2 itself, right? So that takes care of our first week itself. So here we can see Sunday to Saturday, that's the 7 days, that's 26, 27, 28, and then this is 29 here, and then 30th, and then 1st and 2nd. Okay, so that takes care of our first week of the calendar. So all we have to do now is basically repeat this behavior maybe 3 more times to finish off the different weeks that we have, right? So let's set up this next week here. So the way we have to do it is similar. So we can say here, 2nd week, and let's give this a comment as well, so we can identify it. 1st week of calendar, just say 1st week, okay, because everything else is that. So pretty simple. Start a table row and then put 7 days here. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, and then continue where we left off in the previous data cell, which was this was the 2nd. So that means we will have 3 and 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7, and then 8, and then 9. Okay, so this is all we will have. And now let's just do the 3rd week real quick. So we will have 3rd week. All right, and then I can probably just copy this and then paste it here and then edit it based on our requirements. All right, so here it goes to 9. So that means we will have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then 16 essentially here. Okay, and then let's say here on the 10th itself, or we want to put a specific, for this particular one, we want to put a holiday here. Let's say we want to specify a holiday. All right, so what I want to do is I want to style all my holidays similarly, right? So that means if you look back at the Google Calendar here, we can see that all of these different, it's not holiday per se, but you can see that events that is different from the custom user events, right? Maybe nationally applicable or internationally applicable events. They are kind of styled very similar. At least here, the only styling we can see is that there is a background color of like dark greenish, and then the borders are a little bit rounded. So I can use the CSS property of border radius in order to achieve this rounded border if I want to do something similar to this, right? The text color is white. And these are the 3 CSS properties that is there. And then if this whole span box, because this is wrapped inside a span, the way we are implementing it, if it's not going to take the entire width of this table data cell, then we can set the width as 100%. And that will make sure that this kind of spans out the entirety of the width that is available, right? So once you start going a little bit more, once you start having a little bit more practice in CSS, then you can start kind of, noticing how you can apply some of these CSS properties when you look at some kind of styling, right? And that helps to make sure that you keep on practicing it, right? So essentially, because of that, for any label that is going to be a non-user custom event, so for example, let's say there is an Indigenous Peoples Day or something like that on the 11th, right? So I will give a star mark because that is basically the pattern that we are using in order to indicate that a particular day has some sort of event that is associated with it. I will give a break tag as well. Okay, and after the break tag, the same as we are doing, we will have a span tag that will wrap up the content or the text that we are trying to write. And then we will say something like this. So we will say Indigenous Peoples, PEO, Peoples Day. Okay. And then the way I will identify and apply the same set of styling to all of this is basically by creating a class name that will group all of these together. And then I can, instead of picking up individual cells and then applying the same styling to it, I will just use the grouped class name, and then I will apply the same styling to all of them, right? So that is basically what my intentions are when I'm trying to create this class name for this particular table cell itself. And then these span tags that will wrap around the days and stuff like that. Okay. So once this is done, I don't want to add anything else here. So maybe let's move on to the next week. So I will say 4th week. Okay. In the same process, give it a TR. and then we need 7 TDs, right? So I will just copy this block here again, paste it here, and then continue where we left off in the previous week, which is from the 16th. So we will say 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and then 23. Okay, so let's add the same behavior that we had here. So I will add a few more custom events to my 4th week here, similarly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I'm going to pick up, so this is Sunday, Monday, and this is the Tuesday that I'm working with. So again, give it a star, give it a break tag, then put it inside a span. And then within the span, since I'm going to mimic the same behavior, that is my 2 classes that are on Tuesdays and Thursdays, then I will create a UL tag. Okay, within the UL tag, I'm going to create 2 list tags. So the first list is going to have CSI3450. And then the second list item is going to have CSI2520. Okay, so if I save this, that will ensure that Prettier indents it and documents it in a more acceptable fashion, except for this guy here. This kind of looks a bit weird. So we can just take care of this by putting this in a new line by ourselves, and to make sure that it looks a little bit more representable. Okay, so we will do it on the 19th. We will put that, so you can continue for exercise. So this is Tuesday, Wednesday. So you can put one more tag here if you would like to. You can put a Thursday here. But we know what is happening as far as the pattern is concerned. So let's put another holiday for the 22nd, right? So the way we are going to do it is, again, by putting a BR tag, again, same pattern, put a span tag, and within the span tag, you will just say something like a fall break, right? And since this is not a user custom defined event, like class schedule or stuff like that, that is kind of given to us. So what I'm going to do is put the class name, which is holiday for us, right? Just to make sure the spelling looks okay. Holiday. Okay, so that's all there is to it. That's all that we want to do for this one. Okay, and then finally, let's put 2 more weeks here in order to finish it. So this week ends here. So this is the 4th week. So here we will say 5th week. And then where is my default one? So I will copy this. All right. And then I forgot to create the TR element, just paste it here. So we left off at 23. So from here, it will be 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and then 30. Okay, so that's there. And then let's put one more week here, just kind of to make that behavior where it kind of ends that month there and then goes to the next month, so to speak. So we will just say 6th week trailing into November. Okay, essentially, that's what this week is all about. All right. So we'll put the TR. We will paste our data cells again. All right. And then we will start from where the first date is. So this is going to be the 31st of October, and then 1st of November, 2nd of November, 3rd of November, 4th, 5th, and then we stop at around 6th. All right. And then 31st of October, we know what this is. So that is basically another, let's say, holiday grouping. And then the grouping is basically for Halloween. So we'll put a break tag, put a span tag, and within the span tag, we'll just say Halloween. Okay. And then this is how we can achieve the whole behaviorism of this particular month. All right. So let's just check what we did all together. So within the body, we created a container for our entire table. Okay. Then we have a table environment with an ID of it to select the table itself. the table has a caption, and the table has two different semantical sections. One is the header, which is indicated by the tag name table head. And then we have a body, which basically are the weeks of the calendar month. Okay. The header has basically the th semantic tag indicating the labels of the days that we have, that is from Sunday to Saturday. And then we are just creating within the table body each week of our calendar embedded as a table row and then a table data. And then whenever we have some user-defined custom event of the calendar, that is events that belongs or specifically relates to the user itself, we open a break, okay, that forces the next content in a new line, put it inside a span tag that ensures that the text that is being wrapped essentially can be inline in nature if no styling rules are applied. But we are just kind of counterintuitively putting it inside an unordered list, and the list item appears in a new line altogether. So that is how we are creating all these custom events. And then during the times when there is a non-user defined event, that is events that typically exist in the calendar itself, we are creating a class grouping there known as holiday in order to represent that as a grouping, and then apply some similar set of stylings to that. And then we have done that multiple times here whenever those events appear in the calendar itself. So that gives us this final looking product. And then this doesn't look quite presentable, right? So the next step that we want to do is start to style this behavior slowly and to make sure that we can actually generate something that looks a little bit more presentable here compared to what we have generated in this particular section, right? So this requires us to essentially move on to our CSS page, right? So what I'm going to do is we don't want to use this boiler template anymore, all right? This was just to make sure that our CSS was working at that point of time. So we need to start working with our styling itself. So what I'm going to do is first of all set my font family. All right. So again, any questions to this point, please feel free to ask it at any point of time, right? If you have any questions, just stop me and ask your questions, right? Don't hesitate. So the first thing that I will do is set up a font family. I'm not importing it. Remember in the last class, we talked about how you can bring in your Google API fronts or Google fonts essentially into your projects, either using the URL in CSS or using the link tag itself within the HTML file inside the head tag, right? So I'll use something that is kind of universally accepted in terms of representation of formal text. So let's say Arial is there. The other option is Times New Roman that is available. And then the next thing, so we need to kind of check this out. So what I can do here is basically close this, and maybe if I try doing something like this and then remove the Explorer, then we can probably see side by side the changes that happens on this screen here, hopefully. So we want to use the heading. So remember, we have this heading here. We can close this. So let's see the heading, H1. Okay, so we have the H1 tag here. So I'm going to directly select the H1 tag itself. The first thing that I want to do is basically bring this person here to the center. So the way we do it, if we are just working with text and not any kind of elements and then positioning it, so I can simply just say text align to center. Okay, so if we text align to center, then the text itself will move it to the center position that we have specified. And then we can probably change a little bit of the font style. So we have italics that are available. So if you do italics, it looks like this. Maybe we can change it to something else. And let's say we do oblique. Okay, so that will look a little bit more like a golden italic font that essentially is there, right? We want to set the position to relative. Okay. Remember, whenever we do this trick of position absolute and relative, this is to just set up any kind of children behavior with respect to the parent behavior, where we set the parent as relative, and then we set the parent's child as absolute, so that whatever the child is always like stuck with the parent. So here, we don't necessarily have a child for the table itself. There is no children of the H1 tag. But this is just to remind you all that whenever you set something to relative, right, essentially when the way you complete it or basically close the loop is when you want to set the child's positioning with respect to the parent. So what you do is put the parent as relative and then the child of that parent as absolute. So that absolute positioning is relative to the parent itself. Remember this trick kind of helps you out sometimes when you're trying to set two things positioned with respect to each other, right? Then I'm going to give some distance from the top, okay? And let's say I will use the percentage width. So I will just say from the top, it has a 25%, and then from the left, maybe I will give it some value of 2% to just kind of move things around, right? After that, we're going to start working with our calendar style. Okay, so we're going to set the calendar style. So here, what is our calendar environment? It is basically wrapped around this class container called calendar container. So I'm going to copy this. All right, use the dot operator in order to indicate the CSS syntax. Is that what follows is basically a class name, and then I'm going to apply my positioning properties to this, right? So what I want to set is the position as relative as well for this, okay? Just to set up any kind of behavioral environment that is with respect to a child, if necessary, okay? Which I'm not doing this in this particular situation. So from the top, I will again give some separation here, and then maybe from the left-hand side, I will put another little bit of separation. So this will allow me to essentially, so the left 25% essentially brought this table to away from the left margin itself, and the top is basically giving me some more positioning on the top portion of the screen itself, right? So this is what the positioning will cause, right? And after that, we will apply some box model properties to this in terms of giving it a little bit more padding and cornering around the areas what we want to do, right? So remember, in box model of CSS, which is essentially one of the beginning things, the things that you should learn when you're starting with CSS is with respect to layout, that is what you want to do, essentially, okay? So the box model has three different properties. The first one is the border around the content, okay? And then this is where you get the border itself. So right now we don't have any table borders. We're not using the border attribute of the table that we saw previously or that we learned previously when we were working with this. So essentially after border, we basically have a margin, which is basically the separation of one element from another element, the division of the one element from other element. And then finally, the last property of the box model is padding, which is basically the separation of the content from the border itself, right? So what I want to do is first set up some border for this table, all right? And let's say I put a value of around 20 pixels, all right? So if I do that, and then after that, the next thing that I want to apply is basically the margin. And I just wanted to use as much space that is available on both sides of the pages. So I will essentially put margin as auto. I will not specify a value. Whenever, remember, you set margin as auto, what it does is every margin border padding has 4 different values, right? We discussed about this fact that if you think of the page being divided into 2 axes, right? The x-axis and the y-axis, well, x-axis and the y-axis, right? So you have top and bottom on the y-axis, and then you have left and right on the x-axis, essentially. So every kind of positioning property like border, margin, or padding in general has 4 values. So when you write a single value for that, the shorthand notation, what it kind of signifies is that you are applying that same value to all 4 locations, right? Top, left, right, bottom, all of them at the same time, right? If you give 2 values, then you're specifying the first value for the y-axis and then the second value for the x-axis. And this way you can basically unpack until you reach the point where you specify 4 values. Then you start from the top and then move clockwise and then apply those different value units to different directions, right? So this is basically how the shorthand notation essentially works. So in this shorthand notation for margin only, okay, if you specify auto, then what you're telling the browser essentially is to use up whatever space is available on both the y-axis and the x-axis, and then place it using as much as margin that is available. Okay, and then finally, we want to put a padding, and let's say I put a padding of around 5 pixels. All right, so that takes care of your padding properties and your box layout properties for your calendar styling. The next thing that you want to do is start selecting the table itself. Remember, this styling that we just applied was for the container itself and not on the table. So essentially, you don't see any changes to the table itself. You are essentially seeing this to apply to the div container, which wraps this table. Okay, so then let's start putting the table itself, or let's start putting some styling on the table. So we have for the table given an ID here. Okay, so the ID is what we will use to select the table. And remember, CSS selector syntax for the table ID or for any ID element is basically starting with the hashtag followed by the name of the ID that you specify. And then, so here we can give it a little bit of documentation, and then we can say basic styling for the table environment. So for the calendar table, we can start with the basic style. So let's give it some color and stuff like that. So here we can use maybe the RGB format. All right. A quick note about RGB while we are already working on it. Notice here that when I wrote RGB, it came up with RGBA as well. Okay. So RGB, we all understand red, green, blue. It is a color combination that makes up for all the other combinations. So the new thing that you have here, or the another option that you have here, is A. A stands for alpha transparency. Okay, and it has a value from 0 to 1. Okay, so you can give a point value between any point value between 0 to 1, with 0 being the least and 1 being the most. It is basically how transparent a content will look on the screen, right? So if you want to apply not just colors, but some level of transparency on your page, then you can specify a value on the alpha transparency. So sometimes you will see an RGBA value, a way of specifying it. And whenever there is no transparency, then essentially what you will see is just the typical or the traditional RGB value itself, right? So here I can do something like RGB. So this goes from 0 to 255. That's the whole canvas that you have, or the option of playing with. So here I can give something like 9, and I don't know, something like a 2 or something like that. I can apply that, make sure I give it this. All right, so this is basically the text color, and this is like a variation of black. Again, as we talked about this before, in the real world, there is no color that is completely like black and completely like white, right? So there is no color exists in the real world that is a RGB value of 000 or an RGB value of 255, 255, 255. So it is always suggested that whenever you want to use some kind of black or white color, use a variant of the 000 or the 255, 255, 255, right? So this is basically a shade of the black color, which is not completely black in nature, all right? So that is the first thing that I want to do. Let's say then I want to give some background color to this table, okay? So we can again do the same thing. We can do RGB and then put on some values here. So let's say I want to do 253, some variation of the white color itself. So I will just do 253, 247, and 247. So not complete white. You can see that we have the implementation here. This is just some sort of shade of white, right? Looks a little bit like a milk color and stuff like that. So when you want to give spacing between the columns itself, the next thing that we want to do is basically create some separation between the table columns that we have here. So we use the CSS property that is known as border spacing itself. So there is a property for most of them. And then here, all you need to do is specify a value that will cause separation between the tables itself, right? So for some reason, it seems like the CSS properties, oh, it's just because it's minimized. Okay. All right. So you put the border spacing here, and then in order to create the border, not from the table attribute of border. So we want to put the border. So we are just going to use the border property. And what the border property gives us the value of is to specify three things. The shorthand notation itself, that is the thickness of what it's going to look like. Of course, we will not write this. This is not the right thing. We will provide a value, the style of the border, and then the color of the border. So there are three shorthand notation values when you want to specify all of the different values for a border. A border has three different properties: a border thickness, a border styling. Okay, that is, you want dotted lines or you want solid lines, and then what color that border is going to be. So that is the shorthand notation when you just see border and then three values for it. So I will just say that the border will be, let's say, 2 pixel thick. Okay, we want solid lines, and then the color of the border, we want it to essentially be black. Okay, or you can put an RGBA value here. So that will essentially ensure that we get a wrapper around this whole table, essentially, right? But after that, right? So what we want to do after that is, if you want to kind of put some curving around the corners, okay? So what you do is you put border dash radius, and then you can give something like 10 pixels, right? So if you notice here, the moment you do that, the corners are basically curved, right? So the more you increase this value, the more curvature will you achieve around these corners, right? So this is basically what the border radius is essentially going to do. And then the last thing is basically the width of the table. How much width do you want it to take up on that entire page? So this is completely up to you. If you want it to span across the entire page space that is available for this particular browser, you just hit a width of 100%, right? And that it will just, blow up on the entire screen, right? But just to keep things a little bit conservative, so we will go with something that is half of the page size itself, and then just make sure that it is not taking up the entirety of the page, right? So now we can see that it kind of looks a little bit more decent. The reason why the 50% brought it in the view of it, because right now the browser is kind of minimized or kind of, slammed together. So if you increase this, you can see that the table is changing based on the available width of the browser itself. So that is one kind of behavior that is helpful. If you are changing the size of the device, then this kind of percentage unit will also allow your elements to kind of move around, right? So one of the next things that we want to do is basically apply alternate coloring to our entire table, right? So we have seen basically when we work with tables in, let's say, Microsoft Word or Excel and stuff like that, we have these options where we can color the different rows of the table in order to make readability a little bit more better, right? We can alternatively background color these different rows, right? And this essentially is where we can start learning about pseudo elements, okay? So pseudo elements tutorial, CSS pseudo elements tutorial. So what we need to do in pseudo elements, just like we do for pseudo classes, in pseudo classes, the implementation is with respect to a behavior that the user is going to execute against your user interface, right? In pseudo elements, however, it is not about a behavior that the user is going to execute. It is about you selecting an element of your web page that is not a part of your actual DOM. So what do I mean by that? So if you look at our HTML file, whatever we have coded here, this is a part of the actual DOM structure, right? These are a part of your static DOM. That is when this page is rendered on the web page, all of these different tag names and element that we have coded on this HTML file, this will show up as a tree structure for the body, right? So that means you will have the doc type at the very top, and then you will have the root element, which is HTML. It will have two children's, head, and then body, and then the body, and of course, all of these different things in the head. And then in the body, you will have two child nodes. One is the header, one is the div. The div will have another child, which is table. Table has a child of caption and t head. And then t head has around like one child in tr, and then tr has 7 childs in th. So you get the idea, right? So everything that is coded is basically a part of the DOM. But what happens if you want to select an element which is not a part of the DOM, but can be dynamically generated or created as the web page is loading, and then CSS is applying this kind of properties. So specifically speaking, let's say when I'm saying that what we want to implement in this styling rule, so the styling rule that we want to apply, style alternate rows background color, BG color differently, right? So that means I want this row to be a color of a specific color, and then I want to color this differently. Maybe you want to do this altogether completely different, and then you have this row colored in the same fashion. This is different, again, similar to the first row, and then similar to the second row. So what you can think of this is, if I count these rows, so this is the first, second, third, fourth, and then fifth and sixth, right? So you have numbers, and what if I tell you that, hey, select all the odd numbering rows. So everything that is 1, 3rd, 5th will be colored similarly, and everything that is 2, 4, 6, and so on will be colored differently from the odd numbers, right? So what we want here essentially is to basically have a way to use our CSS selector syntax, that is basically what we are using here, and then color the rows. The coloring part is easy. All I have to do is apply a background color. That is not a big problem, right? But the trick here lies in learning about how we can specify a selector which does not exist in the DOM. And when I say it does not exist in the DOM, by that I essentially mean that we don't have anything in this HTML table implementation that identifies odd rows and even rows. Everything is a row. So you cannot select TR. The alternative option is like you will have to manually probably give a class name of, say, odd and even by looking at your product, your final product, and then counting where it is, right? And that is tedious in nature. It's a brute force way. It's not that it's not doable, but a calendar maybe has a limited number of rows here. But if you're working with a very large table, then it will become very problematic to keep a track of which row that you are implementing is odd and which is even. And even if you can keep a track, you will have to give additional class names in order to create that grouping. So that becomes a tedious process. So what if there is a better way to kind of implement that, right? So the better way is to select my table body. Okay, so that is the tag name. So that is where all my rows are. I know that, right? So this is where all my rows are, and I want to color them alternatively here. So what I want to do in my table body is select a child. So my child is basically my table rows. And then I will start my pseudo element behavior. So just like pseudo classes, pseudo element behavior starts with a colon. Okay, it will change. It will have double colons if you're working with text and you're selecting the first sentence or the first letter of a sentence and stuff like that. But in this particular use case example that we are working with, we will have just a single colon. And the way or the syntax of the selector in order to select odd and even child nodes without having to count which one is which is to just simply say, take the nth child. And you can see that, we already are getting the suggestion here. So this is basically what the pseudo element is. So we select the nth child, n is any generic value, but here we pass which type of child category do we want to select. So all I need to do is specify odd values here. And once I specify odd values, so all I need to do is go inside of this and then apply my desired CSS styling. And let's say we do an RGB value and then put something like 224, any random value we can put because, we don't have a client and the client has not specified anything, right? So if you do that here, CSS by itself, as you notice here from the output that we can see, will find all the odd elements, and then it will apply this CSS styling or any other property of CSS that you want to apply to these, right? So this is much easier. And the reason why this is dynamic in nature is because there does not exist in the HTML DOM any kind of element which is an odd table row. So this is being dynamically generated as the page loads. So that is why the pseudo part comes, and the element is because it's a pseudo element, because that element is not actually originally a part of the actual DOM itself, right? So that is where the naming convention comes from. So keep this in mind. This is kind of like a nice way to kind of specify your selector is through the pseudo element. So remember, we used 3 different levels. First is the primary, which is the parent itself. So we take the whole T body, because if we didn't take the body and we took the table environment itself, then that would have colored this person as well. So we want to keep this separated from the actual data. After a space, we specify the table rows. So that means what we are saying by this through this selector is the parent is T body, select all child nodes which are table row for table body. And for these child nodes, select only the odd number of table rows by using this nth child pseudo element property, right? So now if we want to redo the same thing just for practice, but do the same thing for our even rows, I will do the same thing. I will select T body, all child, that is TR, and then go with the nth child. And this time, instead of writing it as odd, all I need to do is write it as even, right? And then maybe I can give a background color and probably specify some sort of background color like this, right? And that will change the whole behavior again and apply it only to the CSS styling itself, right? So now let's put some spacing around these cell values itself. So we will select the table itself again. So that is this guy here, the calendar table. So we will select this, paste this, and make sure we are using the correct syntax. So we will say calendar table itself. And then after calendar table, we want to apply this to a child that is the table header, all right? And then do the same thing for the calendar table, and then apply it to all of my table data cells, right? So essentially the styling that we are trying to apply here is give some space around these individual boxes that we are working with, right? So all I want to do is separate the elements or the boxes from each other a little bit. So I will give it a margin around this. And then maybe I will give it a padding at the bottom in order to create the separation from what follows below of around 2 margin pixels, okay? So that is why I want to apply this, all right? So what if you want to, let's say now, curve just the corner of the bottom of the table itself and not the entirety of the table itself, right? So here we put a border radius of 10 pixels here, right? So let's remove that. So that gives us a table like this. And now what if I tell you is that you just need to corner the last child of this table itself, okay? So that is another pseudo table exercise that will be interesting. That is something that you can try out, right? So what I want to do is basically select my table row and then select the last child. So instead of nth child this time, since I know I want to select the last child itself, then I can do tr last child, and then I can put a border radius of, let's say, 10 pixels, right? Or you can individually put the border radius around the margins, because you need to select specifically. So here we need to give a little bit of context here. Okay, so we need to give T body and then this whole thing, right? But if the goal is to just curve this part and not the rest of it, because if you notice here that if we just say border radius and we specify a single value, remember the shorthand notation of single value essentially dictates that this curvature will be applied to all of these 4 different corners. That's what we saw here, right? But let's say if our goal is to take the last child of every particular row, well, this is not going to work out. So we need to essentially select out the last row from table body and then just curve this much, this location here, right? So we cannot use this shorthand notation essentially, because that is not going to apply it to the specific location. So we need to go using this top, right, bottom, and then left side, and then we need to apply the border radius accordingly in order to make sure that we don't apply the border radius to all 4 sides, because that will look a little bit weird based on the use case that we're trying to implement. So we want to essentially just pick up only the specific location. So I want to put 0, 0, and then maybe 30 pixels and then 30 pixels, right? So you can check out how that is going to look like, or you can reason as to what this is going to mean with respect to this, where you are applying the last child, right? And now let's say if you want to select for the last row's first child, if you want to select the first child of this particular last row as well, right? So first of all, we need to select the last row. So I will start with my body, okay? And then I will start with my table row. But now what I want to do is basically I want to select the first data cell of the last row. Okay, so first data cell of the last row itself. So first of all, when I select the table row, then I need to select the last child. Okay, so I will just specify last child here. Okay, so this ensures that I am essentially selecting this entire row, which is the last child. But from here, I want to select the table data cell, which is the first child, right? So that means for this last child, so I will use this character here, which essentially represents the immediate child of the parent that you're working with. Okay, so here, if I want to select the first child, then I will select what elements first child do I want to select, which is basically my table data. That's the tag name that I'm working with. And there I want to select the first child. Okay, so that essentially ensures that you are selecting table bodies. So this is the table body. Let's go through it one by one. So this is the table body. And then for the table body, we are selecting a table row, which is a child of the table body. And that child, that table row is basically the last child. So essentially, this is the last row. And then for that, we are selecting an immediate descendant of that last row, which is a table data cell. But that table data cell is basically the first child. So you can even take this structure that you have, and you can go back to your HTML page and you can check what does that mean. So when you come to this table row here, which is basically the last table row, this is what this much portion is going to do. That is, it is going to select the table body, table row, and the last child. And the last child is selected dynamically. Then we are saying immediate child. So that means all of these table data, and then we are selecting the table data itself. And then from there, we are selecting the first child, which is essentially this thing. So that is what this whole selector is doing for us. And after this, after you have selected this particular table, then you can select whatever you want to do, or you can apply any kind of styling rule that you want to put here. Okay, so here you can simply just say things like, okay, so you won't have anything on the top, the right, the bottom, but what you need is basically the left, because here you notice that the curvature is coming from the left-hand side itself. So I essentially need to have 0 values on the first 3 and then put it there. So I will just put 0, 0, and then 0, and then let's say we put around 30 pixels in order to get the styling around here. Okay, so that is what we want to implement for this one. Similarly, if you want to do the last child of this, you can do something similar. So that is, you can take this guy up, all right, and then instead of selecting the last child, you can just simply select what you want to do here is td last child. Okay, so this basically ensures that you go for the table body, you pick up the row, which is the last child, and then you pick up the table data cell, which is the last child. So this is the first child that we picked up here, which is the first table data. And then we pick up for the second one, essentially the last child, which is the last row. But here again, things will change a little bit, because we don't have anything on the top, we don't have anything on the right, but we essentially have the curvature in the bottom, and then nothing on the left itself, right? And unlike this, we don't have anything on this left-hand side. So essentially, when you want to do this, you don't want to have the 0 here, you want to have the 0 at the very end. So that basically gives you the application to the bottom. Okay, So now let's say if you want to apply some styling to the caption itself. So we want to paste not this whole thing. We want to paste the ID of my table, which is, so the next thing that we are essentially styling is this caption person here. Okay. So we put the ID of my table, which is the hashtag calendar table, and then select its child, which is essentially the caption, and then start to give it a little bit of background color, and then you can give it maybe anti-white, okay? And that will put something out there. And then we can give it some text color. And these are just aesthetic stuff, just to keep on practicing all of the different things that we have already learned till this time. It's not something that is new itself. So we can give it a font weight of way too bold, right? So that will make it pop out a little bit, right? We can increase the font size since it is a caption itself. So we can probably increase the size by a lot of degrees. So maybe 135% or something like that. Give it a little bit of border radius. Again, the whole purpose of doing this is to keep on practicing and keep on learning all the new stuff. So we can probably give it some cornering on this and this side, okay? And then keep the rest as probably 0 to see what it gives us. So this essentially ensures that the curvature happens here and not on any other side, because we don't want this to mess up with our table. Again, for practice, this is not something that we want to do. Let's change this whole thing to uppercase. So if you want to do that, so what I can do is I can transform my text and I can move it to uppercase. So this is probably something new, regardless of what kind of uppercase, lowercase that you have. You can convert everything to uppercase. You can convert everything to lowercase, right? And then finally, we can give it a little bit of border. Again, remember, border is the thickness, the styling of the border, and then the color of the border, right? So I can give something like 2 pixel, solid, and then black. Okay, so if I do that, that kind of gives another little bit of color, and then that kind of takes care of everything. All right. So the last few pieces that we have is to basically, take care of the styling of our cells itself. So let us go ahead and do that. So we will have the same thing here again. That is, we need to select our table environment in order to be able to work with the data cells here. So I'm going to select all of the children data cells. It doesn't matter if it is direct descendant or not. I'm going to set some width and height policies so that all of the table cells looks more or less the same. Okay, instead of kind of wrapping it around its content, which is what we were looking into right now. We essentially want to give it some sort of a uniformity, and then basically we want to align the contents vertically from the top, right? So that is what we want to do. So now this looks a little bit more like a table. So all we did was set a consistent width and height for each of the table data cells. So regardless of the content, it has that much of space. And then we set the alignment of where the text starts in the particular data cell from the top itself, right? You have left and right options and all those jazz, and you can do all those things in order to see how it looks, right? So let's now give some color to our holiday. Remember, we had a grouping called holiday itself for all of the different holidays. And then we can do something similar. We can give a background color of green. I don't know how green will look. It doesn't look that great. But you get the idea if you want to have a similar behavior with respect to the green. The next thing is, what if you want to hide your events by default? Okay, so we want to hide our events by default, and then basically we want to kind of show it when the user maybe interacts with it or something like that, right? So what I want to do here then is I want to select my calendar itself again. So that is my ID calendar table. And then what I want to select is the span tags. And this is the reason why I put the span tags, is that gives me a little bit of more flexibility in order to select my events now, because all of my events, I know whether it is custom events, user-defined custom events, or like generic events for that particular month. These are all wrapped inside my span element. So that makes a little bit easier with respect to how I want to represent the particular elements, right? So I will set my display I'll put it as blog. All right. And after that, I'm going to set the text alignment and start the text from the left-hand side of the available space that is there. And then finally, what I want to do is give it some text color because these are all events itself. So I'm going to give some RGB values this time again. So I will just say 146. This is some random values. You can try it out. Again, remember, this is about practicing and this is not about knowing the actual value in itself. Okay. And then finally, let's say I want to set its visibility to hidden. So this is the first time in the previous example of nav bars, we worked with display equals to none, which completely removes it from the DOM. This is the other thing that I was telling you about the last time, where you have an alternative way where you do visibility is hidden. The only difference is that this is still here in the DOM structure. Okay, you just don't see it. When you set display to none, it is not a part of the DOM itself, right? So this is basically the difference between visibility hidden and then visibility, display none and visibility hidden. But we still need to show it, right? And of course, the way how we are going to show it is we are going to have some user interaction so that when the user interacts with a particular date cell that is available, if that date or if that event or that cell has some kind of event, then that will be shown on the page. So I want to select my table, all right? And then from there, I want to select a pseudo class that is known as active. That means if a user is working with that particular data cell, and within that data cell, I want to select the span tag, which essentially wraps all of my content together. And all I need to do is change the visibility back to hidden. So that means if I interact with this, so you can see here, all of my content is going to show up. So the way the user knows the content is going to show up is based on these stars. So when you see the stars, when the user clicks on it, remember I'm holding the click right now. That is how I need to implement the active. So this active pseudo class, what it does is basically make sure that you are going to click on it and hold your click. Remember this active is to click on it and then hold the click. If you leave the click, it goes away. So every time I'm leaving the click, the content is going away. So if you want to do something else, so for example, instead of clicking it, if you just want to, let's say, hover over it. So what I can do is I can take this. All right. So instead of putting it as active, I can do the previous thing that we have already seen is that if I just hover over it, then I can show it. So this gives you another way to learn another pseudo class, which is not just hover, but you can also essentially do active, right? So this allows you to apply some sort of basic user interaction on this whole page. So some of the additional self-exercise tasks that I can give you here is, first of all, remove the styling for the lists if you want to try that out. Remember, we already did this for when we were working with our nav bars. So you can practice this here. So in the calendar here, you can see that we still have these list bullet numberings. So you can either change that because this essentially doesn't show up. You can probably put a wrapper around these elements, okay? And then kind of give it a different background color if you would like to do that and make it seem a little bit similar. Otherwise, you can give additional contents and stuff like that. So you can try the removing styling of the list. You can add some additional contents here. So I'm just going to, for the time being, instead of hiding all of this, I'm going to keep it open, okay? All right. So, and we have to remove this. The visibility is still hidden here. We'll just keep it. That's fine. All right. So you can start doing some more styling on the list. So what you can do is you can create additional wrappers around these lists. And the way we use this active, that is when you click on that, it is going to show up. So what you can do is you can remove this visibility hidden aspect and you can change this, but you can put this active pseudo class to this individual event itself, so that when the user holds a click on it, that will open another pop-up and that will show you the content, right? And that pop-up, you can style it as if it was a drop-down menu, right? So remember, in the menu option, we had a drop-down menu kind of behavior such that when the user hovers over that menu, then there is a drop-down menu that kind of opens up, right? So maybe what you can do in order to practice that again is here, in this particular case, you can select this, you can think of this as a menu item, right? So what you can do is then add a drop-down menu to this individual event list. And what the content of the drop-down menu essentially is going to be is additional event details, right? So, and then the way you can apply the CSS styling is whenever the user comes and not hovers over it, you can use the active. So that means the user have to hold their left click, okay? Then that drop-down menu is going to show up. So this is a good style. This is a good practice to work with whatever you have learned before. So please try that out. So we'll wrap up here for today. What we are going to learn in the next class is basically a CSS framework and not like basic CSS. So this essentially captures all the fundamental things that there is to know. Of course, there is a little bit more than that, but we cannot comprehensively cover everything. So as we move forward and as we do more projects, we are going to learn little bit of new CSS styling rules. So what is important for you to do at this point of time is to, of course, make sure that you practice. So you can try this new practice exercise that I told you about, where you can merge the two things of what we have learned previously, or you can apply new styling rules. Here are some, discrepancies are here with respect to the styling. So you can fix all of those things, or you can apply some more stylings to this and see how things look like. And the next class, we are going to learn about Tailwind CSS, okay, which essentially is a CSS framework. Remember, you don't learn something new here. Of course, syntactically, in terms of syntax, you learn some of the syntax of Tailwind CSS, and you see and learn to appreciate how it kind of optimizes the way you can write your CSS codes, okay? But without knowing the basics of CSS, you won't be able to work with Tailwind, even with the reference sheet. So you still need to have some kind of grasp over the fundamentals such that you can work with the framework that is Tailwind CSS, right? So in the next class, we will talk about the setup of Tailwind CSS and CSS framework itself. And then I will do a small introduction on Git and GitHub, okay? Since the class computer there is a fresh computer and believe Git is not installed, then I can essentially show you a step-by-step installation of Git and GitHub, and then hosting your website using this thing called GitHub Pages, okay? So we can essentially sync everything together, we can push it, we can share the link, and in your consecutive assignments, when you're asked to show the results of your implementation, then essentially you can just share, instead of having to share the code on a PDF file, you can essentially give me the links of your GitHub pages and your GitHub repository, and that way I can just check it on my end as to what you have done and stuff like that, okay? So again, all of this code, by the way, is available on my GitHub profile, okay? And the profile name is basically my first name, shorthanded, and then my last name together. So if you go to GitHub and search for the profile with this name, and then all you're looking for is a repository which says CSI3150. Okay, so if you look for this repository, all of the things that we did today is available on GitHub. So if you want to reference it again, and this includes not just what we did today, but what we have done before as well, that is navbar styling and stuff like that. So you can check those out and you can refer to it if you ever need to kind of come back and check what I did or check the code and you don't want to visit the video, then this is where you can go and check the code directly. Okay, so I will stop the class here. Stop the recording and take any questions that anybody may have. And if not, I will see you all again on Thursday in person.